de los abuelos.
First of all, these words are not mine. They are words of my ancestors.
En la profecía de los mayas está,
It is in the Maya prophecy
en el tiempo 12 Bactum,
that in the time of the 12 Bactun
13 Ajao,
and 13 Ahau,
el regreso de los abuelos,
it is the return of the
el
ancestors.
retorno de los hombres sabios.
It is the return of the men of wisdom.
Que amanezca,
Let the morning come.
que llegue la aurora.
Let the dawn come.
13 Ajao,
And 13 Ahau,
Tum,
that in the time of the 12 Bactun
13 Ajao,
and 13 Ahau, that in the time of the 12 Bactun
13 Ajao,
and 13 Ahau,
el regreso de los abuelos,
it is the return of the
el
ancestors.
retorno de los hombres sabios.
It is the return of the men of wisdom.
Remember Eddie Murphy, read my lips. Xers believe sound bites work because they provide accountability. After all, it was read my lips that cost President Bush Sr. the presidency. If he had written a 50,000-word issue paper on when he would or would not raise taxes, do you think anyone would have cared? No. Sound bites. Sound bites provide accountability. Notice the constant appearance today in the young adult pop culture of words like reality, survivor. In the young adult pop culture of words like reality, survivor. It says something about this generation's persona. It says something about kind of how they feel. Generation X, Xers have a checkered reputation. One of the reasons they don't like names and why someone else had to name them, it was Doug Kuplin, who was an Xer, but it's an identity-hiding label, X. And part of it is because they don't think that their generation as a whole is going anywhere. So it's sort of like, I'm not the member of the same generation as this person right beside me, right? We also call them the America's 13th generation. They are literally the 13th in a row since the first U.S. generation of Sam Adams and Benjamin Franklin. We also call them 13 because the number conjures up some of the bad luck and ill timing of their life cycle. I mean, after all, when Generation X first came along, the early 1960s, it was a time when childhood was sinking to the very bottom of society's priorities. Families were beginning to break up. Schools didn't seem to function very well anymore. Polls showed that having kids was not so important as living the good life. Certainly, parents increasingly said they no longer wanted to stay together for the sake of their kids. And the entire culture turned anti-child. I remember at the time I was growing up in California, there was zero population growth. And I remember all these ZPG stickers, things like, none is fun, right? Jesus was an only child, stuff like that. I remember that. And not only were kids a nuisance, they were bad for the planet. And one way I like to sum up sort of the anti-child animus of the entire time that Gen Xers were growing up is by showing you something that I call a brief chronology of the evil child movie era, right? Rosemary's Baby, Damon, Exorcist, they all had spin-offs and sequels. This was the most profitable genre of Hollywood movie, exactly coinciding with the early childhood of Generation X. And when they weren't monsters, they were annoyances, like in Kramer versus Kramer. You remember that? They were horribly bratty kids. Has any of you recently gone back and seen Willy Wonka? That is a painful movie to watch. Just painful. Why would anyone have a kid like that, right? Or Tatum O'Neal in Paper Moon. These were tough kids. You didn't want to hug these kids. And that was by design. Because the design was to raise up kids. You remember, childhood is becoming more indulged for boomers, but it was totally hands-off for Generation X. The idea is that in an era when we're all going to be self-actualized individuals, kids, like everyone else, should be able to just handle things on their own. They have a problem, give them a latchkey guide or a self-care guide. Give them Judy Blume, right, to explain to them how horrible the world really is, right? But I mean, that was considered good for kids. And in fact, when a lot of people ask me, I go into were interested in civic affairs, how greedy they were, all of this stuff, kind of a negative reputation around Generation X. It kind of evolved from that in young adulthood. I often point out to boomers, who are usually the first to condemn Generation X, that they have huge positive attributes of this generation which have gone neglected. I sometimes tell boomers when they entered the workforce, what did productivity do, right? What has it done with Xers? It's gone back up again. Xers really, more than anything else, represent a generation of extreme individual creativity and resilience. Xers, really more than anything else, represent a generation of extreme individual creativity and resilience. After 9/11, everyone was talking about the resilience of America. Which generation do you think really showed that resilience? I don't think boomers. I think it's the "who moved my cheese" generation. I think it's Generation X. I mean, who was most likely in those Twin Towers at that hour of the morning? Who was in that flight from Pittsburgh? Who was in that wing of the Pentagon? Who was shipping out a couple of weeks later to Afghanistan, getting married, signing their wills? This is Generation X. It can take anything you give it. Hugely positive attributes about Generation X. And let's face it, every generation is what it has to be. And this is what Gen Xers had to be.
People in our generation, the so-called 20-something generation, volunteer at twice the rate that people in the baby boom generation volunteered when they were our age.
It's a generation that is profoundly resentful of a government that has saddled it with a $4.5 trillion national debt and spends 10 times as much on retirees as it does on babies. And of a corporate America that has torn up the old social contract that said, you do right by me and I'll do right by you.
This car's all
It's already a legend among happy people.
You're making a very grave mistake if you're trying to make broad assumptions about the psyche of an entire generation. And that's exactly what Subaru did in this ad.
Chrysler, on the other hand, hit pay dirt with its neon ad.
Say hello to neon. We're being approached as a segment of people to market to advertise to. And what we actually are is a group of people that are immune to advertising. We're being approached as a segment of people to market to advertise to. And what we actually are is a group of people that are immune to advertising.
Immune to advertising? Well, certainly wise to it. By the time he or she has finished high school, an average American kid has watched 350,000 television commercials. 1/3 of 1,000,000.
We speak and understand the language of media as natives rather than as immigrants.
1/3 of 1,000,000.
We speak and understand the language of media as natives rather than as immigrants.
The millions of young Americans who are the 20-somethings, younger than baby boomers and yuppies, not quite 30-something. Trying to define them as they define themselves has become a preoccupation because they clearly are a major force in American society and in the workplace. Generation X, our subject for the next several nights. Tonight we begin with NBC's Dawn Fratangelo.
David Mark Cohen.
It should be the best time of their lives, but today's young people graduate wearing a negative label before they've had a chance to make their own mark.
Sociologists call you Generation X. But I believe that giving up is a grave and tragic error.
Generation X, born from 1961 to 81, the generation after the affluent, socially conscious baby boomers. The lost generation, it's called.
They think we're lost, but we're just trying to find something better and new.
Television portrays the generation as this dysfunctional group that lives at Melrose Place.
To suggest the generation has one face, one sound, one philosophy is to ignore that it's the most diverse in a century.
I'm not interested in blending in and getting as much money as possible.
Like repairing the economy and broken families.
They're not out there trying to save the world as a group. They're out there trying to do individual acts of generosity.
If Generation X can accomplish those
They're not out there trying to save the world as a group. They're out there trying to do individual acts of generosity.
If Generation X can accomplish those things, many believe it will be one of the most influential in history.
The secret to success is to take care of yourself as an individual, put a lot of choices on hold, maybe put off making permanent decisions about getting married or about devoting yourself to a single profession or career, and suddenly they're beginning to...
So today we're going to talk about Generation X, right? We hear so much about the baby boomers and how the baby boomers are retiring and reinventing themselves and how the baby boomers need to be managed. And then we're hearing so much about Gen Y and how Gen Y is coming into the workplace and their values are different and their work ethic is different. But we don't really hear about Gen X. And why do I want to talk about Gen X today? Because Gen X, you're the bridge.
Generation Xers, this is the smallest generation of the four, and as a result, we know there will not be enough Gen Xers to backfill the traditionalists and baby boomers positions. We are definitely going to have to rely on both this generation and the Gen Yers to step up as our baby boomers enter into retirement. This generation came of age when the U.S. was in a losing environment. The economy was in a slump, Vietnam and Watergate happened, and we saw the domination of the Japanese from an industry standpoint. As a result, the Generation Xers can be cynical and pessimistic about a number of things. Whether it is a basic business decision, discussing political leaders, and most definitely the economy. This generation strives to be self-reliant, and they really value control. Not that they are not able to work well with others, but they definitely like a sense of autonomy when it comes to work, and definitely prefer not to be micromanaged. This generation lived through a great deal of technological changes during their early years, to say the very least. As a result, they are typically very technologically savvy and very open to adapting to technology. This generation saw some of the first computer labs built in their schools. They witnessed the evolution of Microsoft and the conversion from DOS-based business systems to a Windows environment.
Baloney has a first name, it's O-S-C-A-R.
My baloney has a first name.
It's O-S-C-A-R. And then you're like, what brain space was that taking up?
Spots like these are part of a 1970s tidal wave of advertising featuring us, kids.
He likes it! Hey, Mikey! Want my Coke?
You tell him, little buddy.
They're great! Good!
For advertisers, it is good.
It's Linky.
Especially after school, when they have a captive audience of young Gen Xers. Thanks to a remarkable milestone in American society.